programs. David, could you do it manually?
No, fundamentally not, and this comes back to the pests you're targeting. So there are now multi-kill traps that are getting more effective to control rats. There's nothing that can possibly deal to mice on the scale that we're operating, and we've identified that mice are a key target here because we're in a beech forest system, and I'm sure most listeners are aware of the beech mouse story, how some years you just get huge amounts of food in the system that leads to plagues of rodents and stoats.
Yeah.
And if we take the rats out or the stoats by trapping, then we'd have just a nightmare of dealing with thousands of mice and the impacts they have on the bush. So
it is likely that the poison drop will result in native birds like weka and moorpork dying, and is there a risk of poison entering the brook stream?
Those are issues that were thoroughly addressed in resource consent hearings last year that were concluded there was no impact. It's very true that weka are probably the most vulnerable bird to this type of operation. We saw that from Kapiti Island eradication, which is why the Trust has removed 32 weka from the site to keep them out of harm's way. There's a small number of other species that are potentially at risk, but all the information shows that their populations recover rapidly once the pests are gone.
Okay.
In terms of water, Brodifacoum is very different from Tenatia. It really is not soluble at all. It sinks to the bottom of the streams and mixes with the sediment. We've got 3 sort of trap systems to prevent any pellets leaving the sanctuary. So, yeah, there's been... I guess that's part of the issue with all these things now. There's a lot of alternative facts out there, and I think we need programs like yours to get the real facts across by bringing in people with experience to share with your panellists.
Can I just ask you about that finally and briefly? Why is there so much dispute about this poison's half-life and its toxicity? I mean, it's very hard for most people, I imagine, to decide on what position to take regarding its use when you can read a variety of opinion.
Well, I guess it's really choosing where you get your information. So the Department of Conservation has produced a lot of material on Brodifacoum over the years. There's been quite a lot of research, Landcare research scientists and others. We've put out fact sheets that we distributed into every sort of postal address within this community. So the facts are there, and then there are alternatives which, unfortunately, mislead some people into fearing the worst.
Thank you, David. Dr. David Butler on the panel. Not much time left. Yesterday was Father's Day, or Special Persons Day, as it is now. Now, how was it in some minds? How was it celebrated in your household, by the way?
Not enough.
No, I understand.
You know, when I heard about the Special Persons Day, I thought that was nuts, really. But then I think maybe if you change both Father's and Mother's Day, both do Special Persons Day, then mothers and fathers might have to be forced to compete for the affection of their kids with other people, and this mightn't be a bad thing. You know, if someone else rather than the father gets a gift on Special Persons Day, it might give the father some cause for reflection, you know.
Australian shoppers outraged over a Woolworths mud cake that was on the shelves for Father's Day with the icing saying Special Persons Day. Lavina, do you have an opinion too?
2 things. One is each year, I'm a bit like my mum when I was growing up, when it was Mother's Day. She said, don't buy me anything, I don't like it. It's a capitalist ploy to make money out of you. Don't buy me anything. And then when you get nothing, you get really crappy and get really upset. So I was adamant for my husband he would not have to fold the washing, do the dishes, cook a meal. And then I remembered Father's Day is like every other day of the year. It just hit me in the face. It just hit me in the face.
That's a good last word. I'll give you the last word. Lavina, good. Thank you very much for that today.
Thank you.
And Kevin Milne, always a pleasure to have you back as well.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Lavina.
Thanks for your company, everybody. Here's John Campbell.
Kia ora everyone. Tonight, that's a hole. No, that's desperate. The tit for tat over the cost of post-election spending. National launches its campaign. Labour responds. Our political editor crunches the numbers. Also tonight, a Christchurch artist captures Environment Minister Nick Smith in a rather unflattering fashion. We watch as the 5-metre-high sculpture is transported to outside Environment Canterbury's office. What is North Korea's end game, and who is going to manage this behaviour? The world is looking towards China to pull them in. Plus, a Christchurch couple 7 years on, still living in an earthquake-devastated home, and much more coming up on Checkpoint.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Good afternoon. I'm Anna Thomas. Labor is standing by its fiscal plan, calling a national attack on it a desperate attempt to distract voters. National's Stephen Joyce says there's an $11 billion hole because Labor has failed to roll out each year's operating allowances into subsequent years. Labor's Grant Robertson says its plan has the numbers for new spending each year on top of the baseline increases already forecast.
What we've done is we've put them above the line, so within the health and education lines that are in the fiscal plan, they represent the lion's share of money that needs to be rolled over within any year's operating allowance. We have done that.
Grant Robertson says its plan stacks up and the numbers are robust. The National Party wants to bypass the Resource Management Act to speed up house building in cities. If re-elected, it would produce special legislation to make housing and infrastructure easier and more affordable. Eric Frickberg reports.
The National Party leader, Bill English, says the Resource Management Act has restrained the development of cities, it's dragged down economic performance, and it restricts the supply of housing and infrastructure. He says the Act isn't even protecting the environment of cities properly, let alone making it easy to do business. Mr English and his finance spokesman, Stephen Joyce, made their pledge to a business audience in Wellington and won support. But a planning academic at Auckland University, Elizabeth Aiken-Rose, has a warning, saying the consequence of bad planning is obvious right now in flood-stricken Houston. The Green Party is also opposed to the proposals. This is Eric Frickberg.
Poor communication is being blamed for the unbearable pain endured by a Nelson man before his death. A 64-year-old man who was part of a methadone program had cancer but did not get adequate pain relief. In a report today, the Mental Health Commissioner, Kevin Allen, says a communication breakdown within the Nelson Marlborough District Health Board meant its addiction service staff were not aware that the man was in acute pain and not just wanting more drugs. He says DHB processes failed and improvements are needed.
There was a collective failure of care on the part of the DHB. Various players should have done better and failed to do so. What they need to do, and my recommendations were to make sure they have much better coordination and better communication so that that failure of care doesn't happen again.
The Mental Health Commissioner, Kevin Allen. An Auckland resident says she's heartbroken. A 4-year-old girl was hit by a van outside a daycare this morning, despite her raising safety issues a number of times about the patch of road. The girl was hit outside Bumblebee's daycare centre on Taniwha Street in Glen Innes. Jane Jackson, who lives next door, says the daycare sits on a busy road and has limited parking for parents dropping off children. She says she brought up all these issues when the developer applied for resource consent 3 years ago.
It's heartbreaking because, you know, to try and finally get someone to listen to our concerns, it has to take something like this to happen.
Glen Innes resident Jane Jackson, an Auckland Council spokesperson, says the daycare adheres to all resource consent requirements. South Korea has conducted missile drills simulating an attack on North Korea in response to the latest bomb test north of the border. The live fire exercise saw ballistic missiles launched from fighter jets and the ground, supposedly at the North Korean nuclear site. The drills come as US Defence Chief James Mattis warned that any threat to the US or its allies by Pyongyang would be met with a massive military response. The North says it tested a hydrogen bomb that can fit a long-range missile. Pyongyang has repeatedly defied UN sanctions and international pressure by developing nuclear weapons and testing missiles, and provocations have only intensified. The UN Security Council is to hold an emergency meeting shortly to discuss its response. It's 5:04. The All Blacks prop Owen Franks' season is over, with the tight head set to have surgery on an ongoing Achilles tendon problem. Franks missed the All Blacks Bledisloe Cup test against Australia in Dunedin as he tried to fix the issue with non-surgical treatment. But coach Steve Hansen confirmed today that the prop will undergo surgery on Friday.
We're better just to let him get it right and then get back into some good recovery, have a pre-season and see when he turns up for Crusaders. So we'll see how the operation goes first and foremost and then go from there.
Steve Hansen. Meanwhile, Sam Cane, Ryan Crotty and Wyatt Crockett have all been cleared to play against Argentina in New Plymouth on Saturday. However, winger Wasake Noholo will miss the game after suffering a head knock while playing for Taranaki at the weekend. The Nelson cyclist George Bennett will make a decision on his World Championship participation in the next few days. Bennett pulled out of the Vuelta a España because of fatigue. He was laid low over the summer with glandular fever. Bennett is scheduled to race the individual time trial at the World Champs in Norway this month alongside rowing star-turned-cyclist Hamish Bond. Petra Kvitova has signalled her return to top form with an impressive 7-6-6-3 win over pre-tournament favourite Garbina Muguruza and to reach the US Tennis Open quarterfinals. It's 8 months since the Czech sustained a career-threatening hand injury after being stabbed by an intruder. And New Zealand's Michael Venus and his Taiwan partner Hao Qing-chan through to the quarterfinals of the mixed doubles after a 3-set second round win this afternoon. And that's the news.
Cracking down on North Korea.
Any threat to the United States or its territories or our allies will be met with a massive military response.
Cracking down on gangs.
There's no doubt at all that our gangs are at the heart of the meth distribution system.
The art of the protest.
It's all we've got left, really. When Nick enacted the Econ Act, he took our voice away.
Sam Marn's an artist in Christchurch. He's had a couple of goes at me over different things. It's a bit crass.
All in good taste. Morning Report with Susie Ferguson and Guy and Espina, weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, the growing momentum to bring in accessibility legislation for people with disabilities in New Zealand. And after 10, the longevity list, myth-busting the top ways to live a long and healthy life. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Waikato to Wellington, including Taumaranui, Taupo and Taihape. Mainly fine with some isolated showers and rain developing from Auckland south late tomorrow. Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa. Mainly fine, but high cloud increasing later tomorrow with a few spots of light rain. Marlborough and Nelson as well as Buller to Fiordland, fine spells and isolated showers, turning to rain for a time tomorrow afternoon and evening, and some heavy falls and possible thunderstorms for Buller and Fiordland. Canterbury, Otago and South are mainly fine, apart from coastal cloud about Canterbury, and it'll increase tomorrow with scattered light rain in the morning. And for the Chatham Islands, occasional showers easing late tomorrow. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5 and you're listening to Checkpoint with John Campbell.
Thank you very much indeed, Anna Thomas. Appreciate it. Thank you also for joining us. Coming up on the program tonight, North Korea and what it wants. Our guest is a former Rear Admiral in the US Navy and spokesperson for the US Department of State. Human rights for all, even criminals, and we're at a water protest in the north. In fact, it's a busy old program tonight, but we begin with an $11.7 billion dispute. National called it a hole, Labor called it desperate. It's certainly pre-election politics. A senior National Party source told Checkpoint the party sees the Jacinda effect as most vulnerable to scrutiny of the party's ability to fund its new leaders' values. The hole was identified by Finance Minister Stephen Joyce, also the National Party's campaign manager. It immediately won headlines and then emphatic rebuttals. Stephen Joyce claimed there were 5 errors in Labor's fiscal plan, totalling $11.7 billion and leading to significantly higher debt. Labor pushed back, saying its numbers are robust and National is indulging in a desperate attempt to mislead voters less than 3 weeks out from the election. Here is our political editor, Jane Patterson.
So we're just going to stick to the walkway, so there won't be any forklifts moving in the area, so it's totally safe.
While the Labour leader Jacinda Ardern was touring the Pink Bats factory in Auckland, a fiscal storm was brewing. Back in the Beehive, National's finance spokesperson Stephen Joyce had summoned the media so he could lay out the problems with Labour's alternative budget.
The most substantial error is the error in operating allowances. The way to think about operating allowances is an example of if you pay increased salaries for police out of an operating allowance for a year, that then must continue in subsequent years.
Stephen Joyce says there are also problems with Labour's costings for paid parental leave and multinational tax revenue. And in total, all of the errors would increase net debt by nearly $20 billion over 4 years.
That's a very significant increase in debt. That is increasing New Zealand's net crown debt by 1/3 over 4 years, at the very time when we should be reducing debt at this stage of the economic cycle.
The visit to the factory ended. Ms Ardern made a brief phone call to her finance spokesperson and then came out to address the accusations.
We've factored in everything that's required to make sure we meet population growth, inflation. We've adjusted it accordingly. We stand by what we have done in our fiscal plan. Ours has been independently assessed by an economist. Grant
Robertson also held a media briefing at the Beehive where he told reporters the numbers in Labour's plan stack up. He explained how the party had described the new spending in its alternative budget.
What we've done is we've put them above the line. So within the health and education lines that are in the fiscal plan, they represent the lion's share of money that needs to be rolled over within any year's operating allowance. We have done that. There is around about $6.7 billion worth of money for health for that, and around about $1.8 billion worth of money for that within the education line. So that's where we've put them. What's left over at the end is spare cash.
And Mr Robertson had some criticisms of his own for National.
Oh, look, I just think this is a desperate act from a flailing finance minister. What he's tried to do here is disingenuous, in my view. He knows that we have accounted for our expenditure in health and education going out into future years. He's trying to, I believe, mislead the New Zealand public. I'm sure they'll see through it.
The New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters says both major parties are guilty of making irresponsible spending promises.
If you've got a $2 billion surplus and a $250 million economy, then it's peanuts. One tweak and one change, one tremor from international relations and international economy, and there goes your surplus. So I think this has been a squanderous arrangement going on between the two old parties.
Meanwhile, National's pledging to bypass the Resource Management Act to make housing more affordable. It says the current law is not working well and complex rules can add 50% to the cost of a home, and new urban planning laws separate to the RMA are needed to allow cities to grow. But it's the spending plans of National and Labour that are likely to feature heavily in the second televised live debate between Bill English and Jacinda Ardern at 8:30 tonight on 3. For Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
National's deputy, Paula Bennett, has admitted she blundered by saying serious criminals should have fewer human rights. Her comments sparked a storm of controversy, with the Criminal Bar Association saying it's concerned such a high-ranking minister doesn't appear to understand the importance of upholding the Bill of Rights Act. Mrs Bennett apologised to Bill English after National's leader said her remarks were a mistake, but she's standing by the party's pledge to give police the power to search cars and houses of people described as the most serious criminal gang members at any time. Emile Donovan reports.
Paula Bennett admits it's a blunder, but she stands by the policy.
I don't like that the Prime Minister's had to go out and defend me this morning, so I've apologised to him in regard to that. But I certainly don't apologise for this policy that I think is really good work and will make a difference in keeping our streets safer.
The Human Rights Commissioner, David Rutherford, says Mrs Bennett's original statement was alarming and he's happy it's since been clarified.
Because our major concern here was the statement that suggested all New Zealanders didn't have the same human rights. Everyone in New Zealand has the same human rights.
The National Committee for Addiction Treatment says Paula Bennett's suggestion that serious criminals in the drug trade should have fewer rights will put people off seeking help for methamphetamine addiction. Its co-chair, Vanessa Caldwell, says it would cause more harm than good.
That's certainly been the experience in the last, in decades. And this is like going back to the 80s, where we had the war on drugs mantra, and that has been spectacularly unsuccessful.
In 2009, the Salvation Army's addiction manager, Lynette Hudson, helped set up a rehab program called Ho-Order, a joint venture between the Sallies and the Mongrel Mob.
Notorious chapter of the Mongrel Mob approached us and basically said that they were desperate to get help for addiction to methamphetamine.
Under the program, drug-addicted gang members and their families attended a 7-week rehab camp. It was hugely successful, with a camp completion rate of 94%. And then, at the start of this year, the program folded because its funding wasn't renewed. Lynette Hudson says it's galling to hear National promoting punitive approaches towards gangs and drugs when rehab-focused solutions work.
If you want to get positive change, you have to do something to create an environment and to put the right input into people's lives so that they can and do change. if you want to continue a punitive approach, if you do the same old things, you get the same old results.
One of the gang members who went through the Hauora program, Bones, says he's worried National's policy could be abused.
It's just another form of home invasion, but it's them going to be doing the home invasion on us. So where does that leave me and my grandmother when I'm living with my grandmother? So they just bowl in there and, we come to search your house. Oh, there's nothing here. Well, we're not worried about that. We're allowed to, you know.
Bones says the best way to really get through to gang members and addicts is through understanding and trust. And this policy contains neither. For Checkpoint, Emile Donovan.
Meanwhile, Environment Minister Nick Smith has been the victim of 2 protests. The first came over the weekend when Mr Smith claimed his family was threatened and he had rat poison thrown at him at a Nelson market. The second was this morning when a 5-metre high sculpture of him squatting over a glass of water was unveiled to protest against water pollution. The work by artist Sam Mahon was unveiled in Christchurch outside the Regional Council offices. Mr Mahon says it's a protest against the role played by Dr Smith and the council in allowing a massive increase in the number of polluting dairy cows, which is impacting on drinking water quality. Conan Young was there.
The epoxy resin sculpture has taken Sam Mahon months to complete and was moved into place outside the council buildings this morning in a bid to put water quality issues at the forefront of voters' minds in the lead up to the election. 50 protesters were on hand to watch the spectacle, including Donna Miles-Mojab.
This speaks to the important issue of our time. I think people are really concerned about the state of our water. Speaks truth to the power, which is exactly what art should do. And also it's powerful and it's got a very staying power. I think it's very hard to look at Nick Smith again and not think about the degradation of water at his hands.
Kyle Sutherland said water was the #1 issue for Cantabrians this election.
It's great to see artists like Sam using their skills to really question what's happening in Canterbury, especially outside ECAN, which is responsible for a lot of this damage.
You helped lift this statue and bring it over here. How heavy was it?
Well, it's actually really light. You'd think being such a big piece was quite heavy, but no, it's actually light as a feather.
And what sort of message do you think this is sending, this piece?
I think to ECAN, it's really highlighting how people are feeling at the moment in Canterbury especially, and I think they should take note about the public opinion right now, as people are concerned about fresh water and people will be voting on fresh water.
Graham Townsend said the protest made him proud to be a New Zealander.
I was talking to some of my friends in Africa where I grew up, and they were shocked that we could do this kind of thing in New Zealand, because they would disappear in their countries. If they did something like this in Uganda or Tanzania or somewhere, they'd be shot. We can get away with it in New Zealand, and that's our democracy working. We have got the right to protest.
Sam Mahon will this week drive his latest work to Nelson, where he'll display it next to Nick Smith's stand at the local farmers market. He's hoping to meet with Dr Smith, but says he's not hopeful of making headway based on his experience the last time the two met, following another sculpture he made in his likeness, a bust made completely from cow dung.
We met at his mother's place. She made us lunch. It was lovely. Nick talked to me. I talked to Nick. We didn't listen to each other. At the end of it, I realised it's just PR. And as I was leaving, I said to Nick, "Hey Nick, I sculpted you out of cow dung. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. It's just politics." And he turned to me and he says, "Sam, there's absolutely nothing that you could possibly do that could hurt my feelings." And I saw that, Conan, as a challenge.
Nick Smith says he's not offended by Sam Mahon's latest sculpture of him, but has described it as crass. In Ototahi for Checkpoint, ko Conan Young tēnei.
Now, we've just received video of the incident involving Mr Smith and protesters at a Nelson market at the weekend. Mr Smith told RNZ News over the weekend he was verbally abused and had rat poison thrown at him. He says the situation escalated when he was shoved and had rat poison rubbed over his face and clothes. We will have more on this after 6 o'clock tonight. What is North Korea after, and how far will they go to achieve it? Those questions will be just the beginning of the discussions at an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to be held in New York in just under 7 hours' time. How high are the stakes? It depends on how far North Korea is prepared to go. But a rogue state controlled by a murderous psychopath armed with interballistic missiles that's claiming it's testing hydrogen bombs is a country in need of judicious management, obviously. Perhaps China is the the answer. North Korea's border with China is 1,400 kilometres long, and China often turns a blind eye to its posturings because the alternative is a pro-Western neighbour, and China doesn't want that. But with the latest testing causing a magnitude 6.3 tremor felt strongly in parts of China, suddenly Beijing has to respond. John F. Kirby is a retired Rear Admiral in the US Navy who was spokesperson for the US Department of State. He's now military and diplomatic analyst for CNN. I asked him what I thought was an almost impossible question to answer. What exactly is North Korea after?
Actually, I don't think that's all that difficult a question to answer. It's pretty apparent that their end game is to the preservation of the regime and the governing structure as they know it. And they believe that the only real obstacle to the preservation of the regime is the United States of America. And therefore, they realize that in their mind, in their reasoning, the only way to stop that existential threat is to have a nuclear ballistic missile capability that can threaten the United States, to throw us off kilter, to preserve their ability to keep the regime in power, to be an ultimate deterrent. And that is what they want more than anything else. And that is why they have been so impervious to sanctions. That is why they have been impervious to diplomacy and to dialogue. And it is why, quite frankly, they have been impervious to military threats, or they see it as threats, or military deterrence and military readiness between the United States, South Korea, and Japan. They are impervious to those military deterrents because this is what they want more than anything else. They want the ultimate insurance policy. And I think just recent history bears out that, in fact, they are advancing those capabilities at a faster clip than anybody previously had given them credit for being able to do.
If they are impervious to the United States, South Korea and Japan, what risk are they running by antagonising China?
Well, frankly, that is the only real risk here that I think, and even the Trump administration has realized, that I think they're running up against. There's only one nation-state in the world that has any influence in Pyongyang, and that is China. Now, China has not used that influence fully. They have not implemented all the sanctions the way they should have. They have not tried to use any of their leverage over Pyongyang with trade to try to change the calculus there. And that is because China has been willing to concede and to live with a nuclear-armed North if a nuclear-armed North can be a hedge against a Western-allied South and a reunified peninsula. The only thing that the Chinese want less than a provocateur in Pyongyang is American troops camped out on the other side of the Yalu River. They don't want a reunified peninsula, at least not one that's reunified in a quick, sort of chaotic fashion, because, of course, A, that'll mean refugees streaming across their border into China, which they don't want to have to deal with, and B, again, they don't want a unified peninsula that is allied with the West, and therefore a threat on one of their borders. So their calculus has been to try to sort of let this thing go a little bit and not put too much pressure on Pyongyang so that they can preserve that hedge.
What happens now? Gosh, as I listen to you speak, there are so many conflicting interests. The Chinese situation, if you assume a Chinese point of view, makes absolute sense. Why on earth would they want American troops on their border? So that makes sense from their point of view. The North Koreans, as you say, are simply trying to preserve and protect a psychopathic regime, and they, as you say, are impervious to South Korea, to Japan and America. So how can there be a resolution here where all the parties survive and save face?
Yeah. So first of all, I don't really think we're on the brink of war on the peninsula. I really don't. And if you listen to Secretary Mattis today as he left the White House, I mean, he was very clear that we absolutely will defend ourselves if we come under attack here in the United States. We have that ability, and we'll do it in an overwhelming way. But he is the last guy who wants to do that. And I don't think we're on the brink of war. I mean, honestly, the only thing that changed between today and yesterday is that now they have, obviously, this much higher kiloton yield and ability, nuclear ability, but we don't know that they really do have the ability to put a warhead on a missile and launch it accurately over great distances. So there's the point I'm trying to make is there's still time for diplomacy here. There's still time for dialogue. Now, I'll be the first to admit that Pyongyang has no incentive right now to talk. They have the momentum. They have the initiative. They are advancing these capabilities. There's very little interest on their part in sitting down to talk. There's very little interest, I think, in the Trump administration right now to restore bilateral dialogue or even unilateral dialogue directly with the North. And I understand that. I do understand why there's reticence to do that. You don't want to reward bad behavior. What you need to do are two things. And I think, quite frankly, despite the President Trump's his tweets, I think in general the administration is pursuing this properly. And the two things are, one, an international pressure campaign. Continue to ratchet up pressure on them. If they can enact tougher, newer sanctions, particularly against oil in the North, real significant oil sanctions that are fully implemented by Beijing, you could actually have a real impact on Pyongyang's ability to advance this program and to keep their economy going. Number two, and that is trying to find a way back to the table. Now, clearly, again, we're not going to go to the negotiating table anytime soon directly with the North. But what we need to do is we need to work closer with Beijing to reassure Beijing of our interests on the peninsula and what they are, and just as importantly, what they aren't. Again, if Beijing is worried about a unified peninsula that's done violently, that throws millions of refugees into their border, and are worried about a unified peninsula that is allied with the West, we have to assure Beijing that that's not our goal. And we've tried to do that. Tillerson and Mattis, our Secretary of State and our Secretary of Defense, have made it clear that we're not after a violently restored peninsula, that we don't want regime change. We're trying to message Beijing overtly that it's actually in their interests to try to bring this about diplomatically. And that really is the right approach, and I think they need to do that more. What I'm not seeing, what I'd like to see more out of the Trump administration is pressure on Beijing, not just overt pressure, but trying to convince them that their calculus here, their reasoning, their logic is flawed, and that they have no reason to fear a restoration of some sort of diplomatic dialogue between the six parties and getting the North back to the table. We have to reassure China that we're not trying to get American troops camped out on the other side of the Yalu, that we aren't after regime change, and that we don't want violence on the peninsula. I don't think the Chinese are completely convinced of that, and I think that's why they have been hedging their bets the way they have.
Admiral Kirby, we are so grateful for your time. One final question. Who is the person who is best able, on behalf of the White House, to reassure China of those things? Is it Defence Secretary Jim Mattis? Is he the man for that job?
I think both Mattis and Tillerson are the right couple here to approach this. And I don't want to slight our UN ambassador, Nikki Haley. I actually think she's working this very, very hard, and she has a role to play. But in terms of really making an impact in Beijing, it's got to come from the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, and it has to be a team effort, and the Chinese need to see that it is a team effort, that both of them are serious about what they're saying and can lay out this logic for them in very clear ways. I think they're saying all the right things publicly. What I don't know is happening, and maybe it is, but I'm just not seeing it, that we're actually having these kinds of meaningful conversations directly with leaders in Beijing to convince them that really it's in their interests to use the influence that we know they have on Pyongyang in a more concerted way.
That was former Admiral John Kirby, who was also a State Department spokesperson, talking about the situation which is confronting the Security Council. They meet at 2 a.m. New Zealand time, so what's that? 7 hours or so, just under 7 hours from now. Actually, that's really rubbish maths. Anyway, you know when 2 a.m. is. Let's head north. 200 protesters stopped traffic in Whangarei today in a march against plans for a water bottling operation at Poroti Springs. The springs have been owned by Māori since the 1890s, but an Auckland company has applied for consent to build a bottling factory across the road, and anger is simmering over the proposal. Lois Williams caught the action.
You could hear it from streets away, a powerful haka that brought shopkeepers out of their stores and stopped traffic and tourists in their tracks. Māori and Pākehā joined forces for the march, winding their way through downtown streets, waving flags and placards and vowing to fight the sale of Poroti water. Poroti hapu have been battling Zodiac Holdings for years. The first battle was over water rights. The company has a 35-year consent from the Northland Regional Council to draw water from the aquifers that feed the springs. It only recently pumped up its first truckload and carted it off to Auckland for bottling. But now it's applied to the Whangarei District Council to build a large bottling plant on its site. It's done everything by the book. But for the locals like Kuia Emma Cribb, the book itself is wrong.
It's unjust, it's wrong, and it needs to be rectified. The people have carried this mamai and so on. Please listen to the people.
Zodiac's water consent has a proviso that it can't take water if the flow in the springs drops below a certain level. But the hapu have little faith in that, and they fear effluent from the factory will find its way into the groundwater. They also regard the springs as a taonga, a place where babies and warriors have been blessed for centuries, and a source of food like watercress. And unlike the springs these days, those feelings run very deep.
They're taking water from Poroti Springs. My father was from there, and they've always been fighting, and now they're taking it away and selling it, and the community's not getting anything back from it at all.
Haukainga, we're not happy with these people. Who are they? It's our water, our kids go there. This fella here was blessed in that water. He was given his name, his big brother was brought all the way from Taupo and given his name in that corner. Who the hell do they think they are? Eh?
Whangarei's River Patrol founder Milan Ruka and Kaumatua Hona Edwards led the marches first to the Regional Council building to slip under the door a summary of the hapu's grievances. First and foremost is that they've never been recognised as an interested party in water consents, and they've never been offered a share in their own water. Then it was on to the District Council chambers so Mr Ruka could hand over more than 1,200 objections to the water bottling factory application. Marching with the protesters were several election candidates, including Labour's Tony Savage.
Because it seems to me, from what I've read, that might be a couple of wide boys from Auckland that are coming up here and taking the water. Those local rights aren't being respected at all.
And the Greens MP, Catherine Delahunty, fired up the crowd in the mall.
There is no way that what happens under the ground can be protected if we suck it up and give it away. All the activists on the Y that I work with, we are with you, we are proud of you, and we see you as the front line.
Zodiac's director, the Auckland businessman Paul Thompson, says the company has put its factory application on hold for 2 weeks while it considers the objections. For Checkpoint, Lois Williams.
Coming up on Checkpoint Business News, a Canterbury farmer offers a reward after the brutal slaughter of 5 rare pregnant ewes 7 years on from the first devastating quake 7 years ago. A Christchurch couple says they're spending $700 a month heating their broken home as they continue to fight their insurer. Exorbitant credit card surcharge fees have been banned across the Tasman, so why not here, given many of the banks are the same? Of course, we'd love your feedback. You can text us on 2101. You can email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz, and we are, of course, on Twitter and Facebook. 26.5 to 6. Here's Anna Thomas with the headlines.
Labor is standing by its fiscal plan, calling a national attack on it a desperate attempt to distract voters. National Stephen Joy says there's an $11 billion hole because Labor has failed to roll out each year's operating allowances into subsequent years. Labor's Grant Robertson says its plan has the numbers for new spending each year on top of the baseline increases already forecast, and the numbers are robust. Meanwhile, Bill English says new urban planning laws are needed to allow cities to grow. He's pledging to bypass the Resource Management Act to make housing more affordable, saying its complex rules can add 50% to the cost of a home. Poor communication is being blamed for the unbearable pain endured by a Nelson man before his death. A 64-year-old man who was part of a methadone program had cancer but did not get adequate pain relief. The Mental Health Commissioner says a communication breakdown meant hospital addiction service staff were not aware that the man was in acute pain and not just wanting more drugs. A small protest has been staged outside an insurer's office in Christchurch on the 7th anniversary of the first of the large earthquakes to hit the city. A Christchurch woman, Jo Petrie, whose home was damaged in the earthquakes, led today's protest outside the office of her insurer, IAG. Ms Petrie says she's been fighting IAG over substandard quake repairs for years. The developer of an Auckland daycare outside of which a girl was struck by a van this morning says it was simply a terrible accident. Local residents say the daycare's car park for pick-up and drop-offs is inadequate and want to know if it complies with its resource consent. South Korea has conducted missile drills simulating an attack on North Korea in response to the latest bomb test north of the border. Meanwhile, the United States says it's ready to use its nuclear capabilities to defend itself and its allies against threats from North Korea. And that's the news.
Thank you very much indeed. Anna Thomas, see you at 6. Peter Matheson emailed in. I agree that Kim Jong-un is a psychopathic madman. He says similar to Donald Trump. However, it's worth remembering that North Korea has good reason to not be fond of the US. And then Peter quotes, of course, the early 50s. During the Korean War, the US dropped more bombs on North Korea than it had dropped on the entire Pacific theatre during World War II. Yes, there is no love for the US in North Korea, and that is why China's role is so crucial in negotiating between those very conflicting parties. The UN Security Council looking at this 2 a.m. New Zealand time. Obviously, Morning Report will cover that at length tomorrow morning. What happens next? Let's turn to business news now with Jonathan Mitchell, who is joining us this week from Wellington. Hi, Jonathan. Lovely to have you back on Checkpoint. The election is what? 2 and almost 3 weeks away. I'm not doing very well with my maths tonight. Yes, and businesses and exporters have a wish list, a bit like kids before Christmas, really, for Santa, right? What are they after?
Well, exporters are quite upbeat about their own prospects in the coming years. John, yes, good evening to you. But they are wary about the global environment, this protectionist rhetoric coming out of the United States. But really key to them on their wish list, free trade deals, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, now 11. Getting that over the line is important for Export New Zealand, along with other trade pacts, new ones for Britain, the European Union, ones out of Asia, but really simple for exporters, free trade deals. But if you go to businesses, their list is a little bit longer. They're saying lower tax, more access to skilled staff. That's something we've been hearing a lot about, you know, the skilled staff shortage, but that's something businesses have in mind, along with infrastructure spending and regional development as well, getting that spending out of the main centres right throughout the country. Now, those are some of the key things businesses are looking out for. A recent survey showed that businesses are open to lower corporate tax rates. Most are opposed to a capital gains tax. Increasing that top income tax rate seems to be a bit of a no-no. So those are some of the moods coming out of the business and export community. The economy is humming along quite nicely, around 3%. That's set to continue. Strong surpluses in the short term. That preview update a week or so ago showed another boost to the books. So the political parties have some room to make some promises.
Yeah, they sure do. What happened on the markets today, Jonathan?
It fell 14 points to 7,808. Kiwi dollar just starting the week on a slightly softer tone, 71.7 US cents, just over 90 Australian. John.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Mitchell doing business for us this week out of our Wellington newsroom, which is, of course, head office. Exorbitant credit card surcharge fees have been banned across the Tasman. Australia's Competition and Consumer Commission says it will issue fines or even take businesses to court if they don't comply. Full stop. Australian businesses can now only charge what it actually costs them to process payments. And as Zach Fleming reports, there are calls for New Zealand to follow suit.
According to the Commerce Commission, businesses in New Zealand can charge whatever surcharge they like on credit card or EFTPOS transactions. It was the same in Australia.
Until people got fed up, says Michael Shaper, Deputy Chairman of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission.
A couple of years ago, the federal government in Australia did an inquiry into financial services, and the single biggest public input was on credit card surcharge fees. More than 5,000 responses, really complaints coming in from people saying that they were unhappy with the level of credit card fees that they were paying to essentially pay by credit card. So the government responded with this initiative.
So Australia's government listened to its people.
A business, if they want to charge you for using a credit card or a debit card or EFTPOS, can only charge you what it actually costs them.
Pretty simple, and they're not messing around.
There are some substantial penalties. If we think that a business is breaking the law and they're doing it deliberately and it's having a major impact, then we can either issue an infringement notice, which is a bit like a speeding fine, of a couple of $1,000s, and it actually, interestingly enough, varies if you're a very small business through to a very big business. There are it's a scale of fees effectively, and if we think at the most serious end of it all, we can actually also take it to court, and theoretically the maximum penalty a court could impose is $1.3 million.
And in the UK, credit card surcharge fees are set to be banned by January next year. But here in New Zealand, a Commerce Commission spokesperson says that businesses can charge a surcharge of any amount for any reason they like, as long as it doesn't mislead consumers under the Fair Trading Act. The Commission received 19 complaints in the past year relating to payment surcharges. Sue Chetwin, Chief Executive of Consumer NZ, says New Zealand doesn't have as big a problem as Australia did, but we should follow their lead.
Consumers here are now more exposed to that sort of abuse. Australians have this protection now that we and we don't have it, and we should.
Fees vary wildly, even across similar businesses. In telecommunications, Spark charges 3%, Vodafone 2%, 2 Degrees 1.75%. Then there are exorbitant fees. You'll pay 50 cents on a pay and display park in Auckland, which works out to 25% on a $2 an hour car park. But the Minister of Commerce and Consumer Affairs, Jackie Dean, refused to say whether she thought New Zealand should adopt Australia's new policy. In a statement, she simply and vaguely said that businesses should be upfront with consumers. And that confused people in Auckland CBD who thought it would be a no-brainer.
They need to be monitored.
I think they should restrict them as well in New Zealand, definitely.
What about it frustrates you? Well, having to pay it, full stop. No one likes to pay money if they don't have to.
I try to avoid it. If I'm paying for Air New Zealand, I try and avoid paying for them. I go through the online banking to avoid paying for them. Yeah, they do annoy me.
So in Aussie, they're heavily restricting them now, and in the UK, they're actually going to ban them from next year. Is that something we should do here as well?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Definitely.
Back in Australia, Michael Shaper says some things have noticeably dropped in price since the law change.
People are often paying $7 or $8 for the use of a credit card, and many people saying, I'm sure it's not costing them that much to process my credit card.
Sue Chetwin says if consumers feel strongly about surcharges,
complain to the Commerce Commission, or certainly they can complain to us.
Because consumers complaining changed the law in Australia. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
17.5 to 6. 5 rare and rather special ewes have been slaughtered on a reserve beside the Christchurch suburb of Northwind. All 5 ewes were pregnant and due to lamb in the next couple of weeks. They were Campbell Island ewes, the descendants of a group of sheep taking to be farmed on the uninhabited sub-Antarctic island 700 km south of Bluff. It's brutally cold there, and these are redoubtable sheep. 35 remain, but 5 of them were slaughtered, as their farmer Daniel Wheeler found when he went to visit them during the weekend.
First thing I noticed that they were all in a small paddock that they weren't supposed to be in, and the gate was shut, which I thought was puzzled me. And as I drove across the paddock they were supposed to be in, I could just make out something white in a wee holding yard there, and I guess straight away knew something was up, and then arrived there to find 5 piles of intestines and the unborn lambs.
Wow, so the ewes were pregnant and they'd been slaughtered.
Due to start lambing in 2 weeks.
And these are really rare. Tell me about Campbell Island ewes. There's only 35 on the planet, is there?
35 adult ewes left, which I own. I've had since 2004. Prior to that, they belonged to AgResearch, who have had them since 1974 when they first came off Campbell Island. So they ran wild on Campbell Island from 1931 to 1974 In 1931, the pastoral lease was abandoned and the farm sheep down there were left to run wild. And the Department of Conservation culled the balance of them out in 74, and they were brought back here. So quite unique in that they lived on a sub-Antarctic island, which is pretty horrific.
Yeah.
And in fact, I had a message last night from the great-granddaughter of the first tenant of Campbell Island. It was him that took sheep down there the very first time. So that actually made my weekend.
And what did she say?
She just said she'd felt for me and was absolutely mortified, and that her great-grandfather had been the first tenant down there, and really felt for me. It was nice to know that there was a bit of history there that was 6 degrees of separation.
Yeah, that's New Zealand for you, isn't it? So these sheep, these ewes, would have been the sort of great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughters of the ewes he was farming down on Campbell Island.
Down there, yep.
How bizarre.
Yep. So yeah.
And you have them, this is an extraordinary thing, because you have them in the Styx Mill Reserve, which is, I mean, there are houses not far away at all, aren't there?
This house is viewable. You can look into, people's lounge windows, look over the park, the reserve. It's predator-proofed, so it's got a predator fence around it. For a vehicle to get in there, there's 3 padlocks to undo. So it's, it's quite difficult to get into. There's a walking track around the outside edge, so there's people walking there all the time. So quite shocked. I had them there because I thought it was a very safe place to have them, and they do a conservation job. They help keep the grass short for the parks, for the birds, the pukekos, etc.
As well as being quite lovely neighbours. There's something pleasing about sheep in a suburban environment, isn't there?
Yeah. So there's. I feel quite privileged to be a city farmer.
I'm sure your neighbours feel privileged to be adjacent to a city farm. So have you any idea who is responsible for really pointedly horrific action?
No, a couple of small leads. There was reports of a violent incident over the weekend in which involved the person trying to sell some sheep meat. Whether that's related or not, we don't know. But other than that, it's just guesswork and conjecture at the stage, unless someone knows something. There will be someone out there. It's not a job for one person. They couldn't have got them into the small holding yard on their own. It would have required a couple of people. And to carry 5 bodies out, they kept the heads on them, which is very unusual. So they've taken everything except the intestines. They've taken the heart, the lungs, the livers, the kidneys, and the heads, which is quite peculiar.
Daniel Wheeler, who's offering a reward for any information leading to the conviction of those responsible. He thinks people associated with the killers will know they're responsible. People have just turned up with pretty poorly butchered sheep meat out of the blue and is urging them to contact Christchurch police. We're going to stay in Christchurch. A small protest was held outside an insurer's office in the city today on the 7th anniversary of the first Canterbury earthquake. On September the 4th, 2010, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake hit shortly after 25 to 5 in the morning near the inland Canterbury town of Darfield. A Christchurch woman, Jo Petrie, whose St Martin's home was damaged in both the September 2010 and February 2011 quakes, today led a protest outside the office of her insurer, IAG, over delays to settling Cantabrians' quake claims. Our reporter Maya Burry was there.
Thank you so much for coming today, and it's really sad that we're all here today. So we want change so that we don't have to have these David and Goliath fights.
Jo Petrie spoke to a crowd of about 20 people gathered outside IAG's Addington office today. Ms Petrie says she's been fighting her insurer since shoddy quake repairs were carried out on her home in 2015. She says her family has spent about $100,000 on legal fees and experts, proving to IAG that the new foundations the house was put on during repairs don't fit and the house is at the wrong height.
We know from the internal documentation we have through the Official Information Act that IAG have a lot of information also to show that it's not okay, but yet we just have to keep proving it at great cost to us, time, family time and money. So yeah, those are the issues.
Jo Petrie says it is unacceptable that on the 7th anniversary of the September quake, she and hundreds of other homeowners in Canterbury are still waiting for their claims to be settled.
The process is just so slow, so they have said multiple times that they will help us, they will resolve the issues, and we appreciate that, but we just need it done We need it done in a timely manner, and we're 7 years out.
Another of those at the protest with an unsettled claim is Paddy Brochery, whose Sumner home is insured with Southern Response. Ms Brochery says trying to reach a settlement has taken a toll on herself and her husband, who are both in their 70s.
We spend $700 a month on heating because I've got all the cracks around the house. We don't know when there's a wind if there's another earthquake because various parts of the foundation move. I can't deal with it anymore now because what does it do to your health? It's not worth it, me having a heart attack or a stroke, and we're not going to allow it to.
A Southern Response spokesperson says it is committed to resolving its remaining customers' claims as quickly and fairly as possible. IAG's General Manager for Claims Services, Dean McGregor, says out of the 10,000 claims it has handled, less than 50 properties have had problems with substandard repair work. Mr McGregor says IAG has been working hard to resolve Joe Petrie's claim.
Canterbury has been an extremely rare event. It's a very large event, but for everybody that's still to reach resolution, we understand that there is a real frustration around that. I live in Canterbury, I've lived through the last 7 years as well, so I understand the frustration in the local community. We are very focused on bringing resolution to this.
Mr McGregor says IAG has about 1,000 outstanding residential quake claims left to settle. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Maya Burry.
The Crown says a prisoner knocked out one of his cellmates and threatened 2 others with death in order to rape them. William Katipa has denied 14 charges, including sexual violation, threatening to kill, and is on trial at the High Court in Auckland. Our Auckland court reporter Edward Gay filed this report.
The Crown prosecutor Natalie Walker said the case really comes down to one issue, whether the jurors believe the 3 complainants or Katipa. In her closing address to the jurors, Ms Walker said Katipa created a climate of fear in his cell. He told the younger prisoners he was in for life and threatened them with death and beatings if they didn't submit. When one of the men refused to do what Katipa said, he king hit him and knocked him out before raping him. Katipa's defence is the rapes never happened and there was no sexual contact. But Ms Walker said Katipa's evidence was unreliable and should be put to one side.
In contrast, the Crown says that the evidence of all 3 complainants was compelling, and you can and should believe them. They were honest witnesses telling the difficult truth, whose evidence was internally consistent, strikingly similar as between themselves, and corroborated by others.
She said Katipa hung a towel over the window in the cell door to stop guards checking in. He also covered the emergency button and intercom in the cell with tape and cling film. Ms Walker said in any case, pushing the button was not an option for Katipa's victims.
And also by the probable response time and the fact that pushing that emergency button could actually be a more dangerous thing to do than not.
One of the men told the court that he feared Katipa would kill him before help arrived. Ms Walker finished her address with this.
These were all unwanted, intentional acts, and the defendant knew that. You can be sure that all of the elements for all of the 14 charges have been made out and that the correct verdicts are ones of guilty.
For Katipa, his lawyer Andrew Speed said the 3 complainants had a motive to lie and, as he put it, a faint association with the truth.
Each one of them has a long history of dishonesty offending. It seems as if they've all been enthusiastic members of the criminal fraternity as soon as they could offend in the adult courts in the age of 17. They have, without exception, received lengthy jail for their persistent criminality.
Mr Speed drew the attention of the jurors to a civil case being brought by one of the complainants that involves a claim for hundreds of thousands of dollars. He also addressed the allegation there had been threats to kill.
So how credible is the threat that Mr Katipa would kill someone? Well, when? Where? How? Surely this would be a bizarre thing to say.
He reiterated that his client denied any sexual connection with the men. Tomorrow, Justice Downs will sum up the case before the jurors retire to consider their verdicts. Mo te huataka o te ahi ko Edward Gay aho.
Residents of an Auckland street where a 4-year-old girl was struck by a van this morning say it was an accident simply waiting to happen. The girl was hit outside a daycare centre on Taniwha Street and Glenina shortly before 8 o'clock this morning. Local residents are angry because they say they raised safety concerns about the daycare being on a busy road with a lack of parking with the council before it even opened. Sally Murphy reports.
An everyday task turned to hell for one Auckland family this morning when their 4-year-old girl was struck by a van outside the Bumblebees childcare centre. Neighbour Jane Jackson says the daycare sits on a busy road with limited parking, so the accident was waiting to happen. She says she raised safety concerns with the council when the developer applied for resource consent 3 years ago.
I rang the council and said, why is it opened? Because a lot of things on the resource consent just weren't there. Then the council came out and said, oh, yeah, well, there is a problem. And so their next thing was to reapply for resource consent.
Vernon Sutton, who lives across the road, says about 70 children attend the daycare. Like Miss Jackson, he's frustrated the concerns they've raised over the past 3 years have not been listened to.
Almost 300 buses a day go past. So it's listed as a main arterial route. We didn't believe that the drop-on, drop-off, the parking, the so-called school bus or daycare bus that's never materialised was going to take care of any of the safety issues that we had regarding daycare centre children being picked up and dropped off, and here we are, very sad.
He says the small daycare car park isn't adequate and something needs to be done to make the centre safer.
There should have been maybe a drop-off zone labelled on the road. Obviously the council and AT have to take some responsibilities here because they've indicated there is no issue. The developer basically needs to come on board if he's going to keep developing these sites all over Auckland. He needs to take the safety of the children and the people that use his centres a lot more seriously than he does. At the moment it's just a big money-making exercise, frankly.
The council says it's received a number of complaints about the daycare centre, but none relating to traffic safety. And Bumblebee's developer JP Singh says he has no concerns about it being located on a busy road or about parking, and says everything has been done up to council standard. He describes the incident as a terrible accident and says his thoughts are with the 4-year-old and her family. The girl remains in a critical condition in intensive care at Starship Hospital. In Auckland for Checkpoint, Sally Murphy.
It's coming up to 3 minutes to 6. You're with a Checkpoint on RNZ. Thank you for being with us. One of the founders of the popular 1970s band Steely Dan has died at the age of 67. Walter Becker was the group's lead guitarist. Steely Dan took elements of jazz and rock and moulded a meticulous and intelligent pop music, giving Becker and his friend and co-founder Daniel Fagan hits around the world while they were still in their early 20s. Here's the BBC's Sophie Long with this look back at his life.
Are you reeling in the years, stowing away the time? Are you gathering up the tea?
Reeling in the Years, one of Steely Dan's biggest hits. As the co-founder and guitarist, Walter Becker helped shape the band's distinctive jazz rock sound. He formed Steely Dan with his college friend Donald Fagan in the 1970s.
Ricky, don't lose that number. It's the only one you own. You might use it.
Hits like Ricky Don't Lose That Number saw the group go on to sell more than 40 million albums. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2001. Paying tribute to his friend, Fagan said he was smart as a whip, a great songwriter and hysterically funny. He described how they started writing nutty little tunes on an upright piano in their college dorm. Rolling Stone once said the pair were the perfect musical anti-heroes for the 70s. Today, Fagan said he intended to keep the music they created together alive for as long as he can.
Are you reeling in the years, stowing away the time?
Steely Dan, Anna Thomas, who was sitting beside me waiting to the news, was singing along.
I was. Takes me right back. It does. Ashburton days. Lovely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Ash Vegas.
Sophie Long was the reporter. Reeling in the Years from Steely Dan's first album, Can't Buy a Thrill, was recorded in 1972 when Walter Becker was just 22. It always sounded like such grown-up music to me.
Absolutely.
They were kids. Amazing. Hi, John in Wellington. Every parking fee paid by card incurs a 50-cent surcharge. Yeah, same in Auckland, I think. As a percentage of the total cost of the parking, that is an outrage, isn't it? Lots of people contacting us about parking. Also, lots of people are saying, hey, we don't know who to believe. Stephen Joyce says $11.7 billion hole. Labor says you are desperate and cynical. Well, we're going to have precisely that discussion with Brian Fellow, who was really pressing it in a column he wrote for the Herald on Saturday and has in fact been crunching the numbers today in an attempt to get to the bottom of how there can be an $11.7 billion difference over Labor's spending plan for after the election. Brian Fellow will join us after the news at 6. And we are looking forward to that conversation very much, as I know some of you are. You can text us on 2101. You can email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. And don't forget, because we haven't reminded you of this for a wee while, you can watch us on Facebook, where we are live streaming, Freeview Channel 50 and Sky TV Channel 83, which is Face TV. It's 6 o'clock. Coming up, Steely Dan fan Anna Thomas with the news.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good evening, I'm Anna Thomas. Labor says National's attack on its fiscal plan is a desperate attempt to mislead voters. National says there's an $11 billion hole in Labor's alternative budget, primarily because it's failed to roll out each year's operating allowances into subsequent years. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
Labor's standing firmly by its plan, saying the numbers stack up and have been independently checked. National says the main problem is the new money is not rolled over from year to year, which is needed if increases are made to the likes of pay rises for police and nurses. But Labor says its plan has the numbers for new spending each year on top of the baseline increases already forecast. National also claims expanded paid parental leave is not accounted for. Labor says it's fully costed and part of the families package. Labor says this is a desperate and cynical attack from National that won't fool New Zealanders. This is Jane Patterson.
The Greens say National Party proposals to speed up house building in cities will only benefit developers. If re-elected, National says it would produce special legislation to bypass the Resource Management Act to make housing and infrastructure easier and more affordable. It says the RMA is dragging everyone down. But the Green Party's Environment spokesman, Eugenie Sage, calls the proposal special housing areas on steroids.
The Minister blames the RMA repeatedly. We need coherent reform of the RMA, not a series of ad hoc band-aids which shut out the public, which reduce access to the courts by sidelining the Environment Court, and which are a charter for property developers by making development very easy for them.
The Green Party's Eugenie Sage. The Mental Health Commissioner says a communication breakdown was behind the unbearable suffering of a Nelson man dying of cancer. Kevin Allen says the unnamed 64-year-old needed pain relief but was on a methadone program to reduce drug dependence. He says when the man was diagnosed with liver cancer and in increasing pain, a lack of communication between doctors at the Nelson Marlborough District Health Board and its addiction service let him down.
Doctors in the hospital service arranged for pain relief, but without reference to the addiction service. They were required to liaise with the addiction service. They failed to do that. The addiction service also didn't follow through enough to ensure that the treatment that he was receiving was appropriate.
Mental Health Commissioner Kevin Allen. The developer of an Auckland daycare where a girl was struck by a van this morning says it was simply a terrible accident. Local residents say the daycare's parking for parents dropping off and picking up children is inadequate, and they want to know if it complies with its resource consent. Sally Murphy reports.
Jane Jackson, who lives next door to the daycare, says she raised concerns about it being on such a busy road when the developer applied for consents 3 years ago. She says at peak times there is nowhere for parents to park, to drop off or pick up their children safely. Daycare developer JP Singh says it was simply a terrible accident and he has no safety concerns. An Auckland Council spokesman says they have received complaints about the daycare since it opened, but none about traffic safety. The 4-year-old girl remains in a critical condition in Starship Hospital. In Auckland, Sally Murphy.
The Crown says a prisoner sentenced to preventative detention used intimidation and violence to rape 3 of his cellmates. William Katipa has denied 14 charges, including sexual violation and threatening to kill. Edward Gay reports from the High Court in Auckland.
In his closing address to the jurors, Katipa's lawyer Andrew Speed said each of the complainants have a significant criminal history and knew how to play the system to get what they wanted. Mr. Speed also drew the attention of the jurors to a civil case being brought by one of the complainants, which involves a claim against the Corrections Department for hundreds of thousands of dollars. He also said that any threat to kill inside prison would be bizarre and questioned how such a threat could be carried out. Mr. Speed reiterated that his client denied any sexual connection with the men. Atu i te kōti mātua ko Edward Gay aho.
A new world record has been set for carrying mugs of beer in southeastern Germany. In Bavaria, which is also home to Oktoberfest, the world's biggest beer festival, Oliver Strumpfeld cradled 31 beer-filled tankards stacked up in 2 tiers, walked 40 metres and then set them down. But 2 tipped over at the last minute, so that the record is 29 jugs, or more than 69 kilograms of beer and glass. Mr. Strumpfeld trained at the gym 3 to 4 times a week since February to prepare for today's attempt. He set the previous world record of 25 jugs in 2014. It's 6:05. To sport now, in All Blacks Sam Cane, Ryan Crotty and Wyatt Crockett have all been cleared to play in this Saturday's Rugby Championship match against Argentina in New Plymouth. The trio have recovered from head clashes suffered in the All Blacks win over Australia in Dunedin 2 weekends ago. But the news isn't so good for prop Owen Franks and Win Wasaki in Naholo. Franks requires surgery to an ongoing Achilles tendon problem and is out for the rest of the season, while Naholo will miss Saturday's game after suffering a head knock playing for Taranaki at the weekend. Blues flanker Blake Gibson has been called in as cover, while Crusaders flanker Matt Todd is out with a hand injury. Coach Steve Hansen believes Gibson has got a lot to offer.
He's good over the ball, he's a strong physical player, he's, his history in the game is pretty good. He's a New Zealand under-20 player, a lot of talent, and has done a good job. Though he's copped a few injuries for the Blues in Auckland, we still think he's got a future.
All Blacks coach Steve Hansen. New Zealand snowboarders Zoe Sadowski-Synnott and Carlos Garcia-Knight have shown their Olympic medal credentials at the Winter Games in Cadrona. The pair lined up in today's slope-style finals, with 16-year-old Sadowski-Synnott putting down a strong first run in the women's event to claim bronze. Knight also picked up a bronze medal in the men's section. And Petra Kvitova stunned Spain's Wimbledon champion and third seed Garbine Muguruza 7-6, 6-3 to enter the quarterfinals of the US Tennis Open. And New Zealand's Michael Venus and his Taiwan partner Hao Chin-chan are through to the quarterfinals of the mixed doubles after a second round win. And that's the news.
Tonight on Night's Catherine Foster on the joys of apartment living in New Zealand. I mean, what is a backyard good for these days, apart from infill housing? We have a window on the intersecting worlds of bread and social class, because being upper crust is not solely determined by how much dough you earn. And this week's After Dinner Science comes courtesy of our geologist, Hamish Campbell. I thought I'd ask him about landslips on Nights with me, Brian Crump, from After the News at 7 on RNZ National.
And now the short forecast from Med Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Waikato to Wellington, including Taumaranui, Taupo and Taihape. Mainly fine with some isolated showers and rain developing from Auckland south late tomorrow. Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa. Mainly fine but high cloud increasing later tomorrow with a few spots of light rain. Marlborough and Nelson, as well as Bulla to Fiordland. Fine spells and isolated showers, turning to rain for a time tomorrow afternoon and evening, and some heavy falls and possible thunderstorms for Bulla and Fiordland. Canterbury, Otago and Southland mainly fine, apart from coastal cloud about Canterbury, and it'll increase tomorrow with scattered light rain in the morning. For the Chatham Islands, occasional showers easing late tomorrow. RNZ National, it is 6:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint with John Campbell.
And Anna Thomas reading the news. Thanks so much, Anna. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you.
National took an $11.7 billion swipe at Labor today, saying that was the size of the hole in its fiscal plan as it sought to portray the party and leader Jacinda Ardern as weak on the economy. National says Labor's biggest error is failing to roll out each year's operating allowances into subsequent years, which would increase the government's debt by $20 billion over the next 4 years. For its part, as you heard from our political editor earlier in the program, Labor says its numbers are robust, have been independently assessed, and Nationals are just indulging in a desperate attempt to mislead voters less than 3 weeks out from the election. So what can voters make of all of this just a couple of hours before the second televised showdown between Jacinda Ardern and Bill English? Economics columnist Brian Fellow, a former New Zealand Herald economics editor, joins us on the line from Wellington. Really nice to have you on Checkpoint, Brian. You are a remarkably prescient man, because over the weekend I read your piece in the Herald, Brian Fellow, National Scrooge versus Labor Spendthrift. Not really. It was a very fine piece of writing. 11:35 this morning, lo and behold, out comes a media statement from the Nat saying $11.7 billion hole in Labor's fiscal numbers. What's going on here?
Well, I mean, in terms of the argument, I think Robertson's right and Joyce is wrong. It's not really that complicated. I mean, if you look at Joyce's budget, over the next 4 years, there's a line, total Crown operating expenses.
Yep.
In his budget, that adds up to $440 billion over the 4 years. The exact equivalent number in Labor's plan is $448 billion, so it's only $8 billion more. And meanwhile, of course, Labor plans to cancel the tax cuts, so it gets $7.4 billion more tax. So the money isn't missing. It's just been reallocated in this, because that $440 billion in Joyce's budget includes a pretty roomy operating allowance or a pot of money that is yet to be allocated to anything in future budgets. In his case, it adds up to $11.7 billion.
Yeah, that's right.
Over the next 4 years. Grant Robertson has sort of delved into that and moved. He ends up with a cumulative $4.5 billion left unallocated. So he's taken basically $7 billion out of that unallocated line and committed it to health and education and I think working for families and so on. So it's just moved in the jargon from below the line to above the line, from unallocated to committed spending. But it hasn't, it is there. Now, National would say its approach is more flexible. Labor would say its approach is more transparent and realistic. But it's a presentational choice. There's nothing dodgy about the numbers.
So if it's a presentational choice, and if we look at the National Party media releases, and then Minister Joyce, who is obviously Finance Minister, but also National Party's head of campaign strategy, he issues a media release with 5 errors. He reiterates those in his media conference. And the big one is failing to roll out the operating allowances for each year into subsequent years, a total of $9.4 billion. He says all of this would cost jobs and eat into family budgets. Now, that gets big coverage. That's a good headline. It takes a while for Labor to respond. An awful lot of journalists who are covering this don't really understand what everyone's talking about.
I don't blame them.
No. And so is this disingenuous by Joyce? Is this a good faith error? Is this a difference of interpretation? What's going on here?
I don't want to put a moral cast on it. I think Labor could have been a bit more clear in the way it presented its operating balance, that it is for each of those lines the residual, the stuff that they have yet to commit, rather than an accumulating total. So if you take, for example, the 2021 year, Labor's got a figure of $1.5 billion. The equivalent figure in Joyce's budget is $5.5. Now, the $4 billion that's, so to speak, missing has been moved up and allocated to health and education and so on. So it is there, but instead of it, you see what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. This plays to the narrative, doesn't it, that suits the Nats. And a National Party source who was typically highly reliable told me today that One of the ways that the Nats are planning to negotiate the Jacinda effect, and of course they will want to do that, is to say that the country simply can't afford the values she is espousing. Now, you've crunched the numbers, and I really recommend you'll read National Scrooge versus Labour Spendthrift. That's in the Herald. It's available online. You've looked at the cost of Labour's extra spending, and you asked the question, where is the extra $15.1 billion to come from? What's the answer to that question?
Well, okay, it's a good question. Half of it sounds good for Labour to say we're going to spend $14.5 billion more over these 4 years. Half of that money is coming from the extra tax they'll get in, and the other half is coming out of this operating allowance kitty. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
That's it. They've also got a slightly higher interest bill because they're paying down debt more slowly.
So when you say, when the old phrase, the devil's in the detail, actually the devil's in the interpretation here, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. But, you know, it's the old thing, lies, damn lies and statistics.
Yeah. Yes, and
complicated.
Yeah, that's right. And journalists.
I might add, John, though, that all of this is about operating expenses. There's a whole separate story about capital items, and some of the bigger numbers that National has been throwing around in this campaign aren't in any of this. They're capital items, like $10 billion more for roads and so on. Labor also has some pretty chunky capital items, like resuming contributions to the Cullen Fund early and a couple of billion to Pump Prime Kiwi build. So none of those figures on either side of the argument are included in this discussion, which is all about operating expenses.
It's going to be a fascinating... Well, and the problem is, of course...
The bottom line, John, is that, all of these numbers may well be rendered moot by some almighty international shock over the next 3 years.
Yeah. Brian Fellows, former economics editor of the New Zealand Herald, still an excellent economics columnist, and you can read his article, National Scrooge versus Labour Spendthrift, in the Herald. It's available online. Thank you so much for your time and your analysis and insight, Brian. This is a fascinating area because a lot of journalists are flummoxed by numbers and everyone is required to cover them very fast. So it simply becomes a matter of he said, she said, right? 6:15, a re-elected National-led government has pledged to bypass the Resource Management Act to speed up house building in cities. Instead, special legislation would make it easier to build more housing and infrastructure and make it more affordable. But critics say the flip side could lead to bad planning and cite Houston as an example, very timely example. Eric Frickberg explains.
The National Party leader, Bill English, says the Resource Management Act has restrained the development of cities, dragged down their economic performance and restricted the supply of much-needed housing and infrastructure.
Planning law with excessive red tape can add around 50% to the cost of a house. Well, that is being paid for by our families.
Mr English and his finance spokesman Stephen Joyce made the pledge to a business audience in Wellington. Mr English said the Resource Management Act wasn't even protecting the environment of cities properly, let alone making it easier to do business, so a new planning law would come into effect that would bypass it.
We want to see every young New Zealander have the opportunity to buy their own home. We want to see every young entrepreneur to set up their business at reasonable cost, to see our manufacturers and our creative people have access to land and space to carry out their businesses.
Most in the audience were receptive to the plan, including David Prentice. He's CEO of the construction and infrastructure consultancy Opus. He says the proposal should make it easier and cheaper to buy a house.
Theoretically, in time, it will make it far more efficient and far easier, and ultimately, of course, and cheaper. I think it's been a long time coming, quite frankly, and I think for the government to come out now and announce this is a very smart, proactive, forward-thinking move.
A partner at PwC, Jeff Nightingale, was also in favour.
I think there's real merit in looking at how you remove some of the blocks for urban development. We need to increase the supply of land for development so that it can feed back into housing prices. So it's certainly worth thinking about. You don't want to abandon the environmental standards, but you do want to work out how to do it more quickly and more efficiently.
But a senior lecturer at Auckland University's School of Architecture and Planning took a different view. Elizabeth Aitken-Rose says the consequence of bad planning is obvious right now in Texas.
The city of Houston is famous for not having planning, and it has been swamped. The houses have been built on floodplains. We build on floodplains here, and then when they flood, we get extremely upset.
The National Party's plan is supported by Infrastructure New Zealand and by the Property Council. However, the Green Party is calling it Nick Smith special housing areas on steroids, and it would be a windfall to property developers. However, National says it's done what it can with incremental changes to the Resource Management Act, and purpose-built legislation is needed. For Checkpoint, Ko Eric Frickberg Tene.
A member of the anti-poison protest group accused of smearing poison on Nelson MP Nick Smith says a road faction could have done it, but the group has condemned the behaviour. Dr Smith has laid a complaint with police after what he says was rat poison was rubbed into his clothes and face, and threats were made against his family during his regular public meetings next to the Nelson market. A volunteer helping him says in all her years she's not experienced a moment as frightening as what happened on Saturday. Here's our Nelson reporter Tracy Neal with the story.
Nelson's long-serving MP has always run an open-door policy for constituents who roll up each week to his caravan to air grievances, seek help or let off steam. Dr Smith, who's also the Environment Minister, says he's used to getting a bit of lip and he's generally tolerant, but what happened on Saturday went too far. One of his regular helpers at the market, Jenny Sauer, explains what she saw happen.
We were closing up and these people more or less came up to see Nick, and this lady had her phone out and was filming Nick with her iPhone, and then out of nowhere they lobbed something of material into the caravan and hit me on my chest with one, and I realised then looking down it was bait thing like rat poison.
Ms Sauer says it was when Dr Smith came out of the caravan to try and calm the situation that he had a pellet rubbed on the lapel of his shirt and on his skin, but claims have been made that he wasn't touched at all. Dr Smith says the attack was linked to the contentious argument about a poison drop underway in a Nelson wildlife sanctuary. He says he was taken aback at how verbal abuse escalated into what amounted to being assaulted.
I advised a volunteer that was with me there to ring the police, at which time they departed, albeit making accusations that they were going to attempt to poison myself and my family.
The community group challenged the operation allowed under new national regulations for pest control. The High Court and the Court of Appeal agreed the aerial drop was lawful and it began in the Brook Sanctuary on Saturday. A member of the community group, Anne Fitzsimon, says it's possible someone has acted alone, claiming to be part of the group, but says the anti-poison bait drop group was not involved.
But I know very much from what correspondence and what things have come along at meetings, there has been some extreme behaviour that was nothing to do with the group. The group has condemned that.
Ms Fitzsimon says the group does not support what amounts to vigilante behaviour. Dr Smith says the couple involved were not known to him. Ms Sauer says it was an upsetting end to the day.
Well, it was very, very frightening because we're just there as volunteers and we'd had a good morning, but it was just the unprovoked way they came tearing up and just started lobbing these pellets at Nick's caravan.
No one has been charged in relation to the incident and the police say inquiries are continuing. In Nelson for Checkpoint, Tracy Neal.
In the past hour, Checkpoint has seen a video of the incident. In it, Mr Smith is confronted by a male and female concerned about the 1080 drop at the Brook Sanctuary. The couple and another person behind the camera heckle Mr Smith, and the man wipes his hands on both sides of Mr Smith's blue jacket. A woman who appears to be one of Mr Smith's helpers, assistants, whatever, dials 111 and the couple leaves. Mr Smith then goes into the caravan. The incident is unpleasant, but at no point in the video we have seen is rat poison thrown at Mr Smith or smeared on his face. We invited Mr Smith to clarify the situation on the programme. His office said he's flying and in meetings tonight and unavailable, but he stands by his statement. He says some of the incident happened inside his caravan and he urges anyone with photos to contact the police. 22 minutes past 6. The US President has responded to the latest North Korean nuclear tests by threatening to cut trade ties with any nation still doing business with North Korea. Number one, of course, China. That threat squarely aimed at Beijing, with North Korea almost totally reliant on trade with China simply to survive. The US Defense Secretary has warned of a huge military response in Pyongyang, if Pyongyang targets the US or any of its allies. As the ABC's Ann Barker reports, the response to the latest move from North Korea may be more economic than military, and that in itself could be a major problem around the globe.
The United States is again weighing its response to the latest nuclear provocation. US Defence Secretary Jim Mattis has warned that any threat to the US or its territories will be met with a massive military response.
We have many military options, and the President wanted to be briefed on each one of them. We made clear that we have the ability to defend ourselves and our allies, South Korea and Japan, from any attack, and our commitments among the allies are ironclad. Any threat to the United States or its territories, including Guam, or our allies, will be met with a massive military response, a response both effective and overwhelming.
Though President Donald Trump has refused to be drawn on whether the US would attack North Korea.
Mr. President, will you attack North Korea?
Telling reporters only, we'll see. Instead, Donald Trump has warned of even tougher sanctions against North Korea and its allies, namely China, which most international leaders believe can and should do more to put pressure on Pyongyang. On Twitter, President Trump warned the US was now considering stopping all trade with any country that does business with North Korea. And Australia's Foreign Minister Julie Bishop has appealed to China to cut all trade with the rogue regime.
What we're seeking to do is block North Korea's access to finance so that we stop it funding its illegal ballistic missile and nuclear test programs. China is the major source of finance for North Korea. It's its major trading partner. But China is part of this tough sanctions regime and backed the 5th of August sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council.
In reality, cutting US trade with China could hurt the US as much as it might bring pressure on North Korea and in turn would hurt other US allies.
Clearly, China and the United States are major trading partners for Australia, so we want to avoid any kind of trade war between China and the United States, but we certainly back the United States' concerns and the concerns of China that North Korea should be prevented from accessing the finance that it's using for its illegal weapons program.
More likely in the immediate future is an escalation in sanctions against Pyongyang. The US is already drafting new measures likely to be discussed as early as tomorrow at the UN Security Council, which could target North Korea's national airline and textile exports. Already, European leaders, including Britain's Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, have indicated their support.
We think that the sanctions route still holds potential. China is responsible for 90% of North Korea's trade, and North Korea has only 6 months of oil supplies left. There is scope to continue to put pressure on the regime.
There's no guarantee, of course, that even tougher sanctions would produce the required result, or, as was the case with the August sanctions, simply enrage Pyongyang even further and lead to more nuclear tests. And Germany's Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel has warned of a nuclear arms race if Pyongyang is allowed to continue its missile program. It's a tremendous provocation, but it also shows the North Koreans are serious about developing nuclear weapons. He says they'll succeed in a few years. This will be led to South Korea, Japan, other nations in the region. They'll all acquire nuclear weapons as well. And for its part, South Korea has today carried out a live-fire exercise intended to simulate a strike on North Korea's nuclear test site, with surface-to-surface ballistic missiles and fighter jets from the Army and Air Force hitting targets off South Korea's east coast.
It's the ABC's Ann Barker. Just as an aside, although it's quite a big and important aside, the US imported $463 billion worth of goods from China in 2016. Cutting off trade between the two would be a trade war, of course, which would almost certainly trigger a global recession. Bomb disposal experts in Frankfurt have successfully defused a massive unexploded bomb from World War II. The news was greeted with spontaneous applause among some of the more than 60,000 people who were evacuated to enable experts to make the bomb safe. Many residents are now awaiting permission to return to their homes. The evacuation was the biggest in post-war German history, involving hundreds of officials and extremely careful planning, the BBC's Sarah Corker reports.
Blockbuster, so called for its ability to flatten an entire street. The British-made bomb weighs 1.4 tonnes and buried for more than 70 years, the fear was it may have become unstable over time. And so on Sunday, there was a mass evacuation of Frankfurt's city centre as technicians worked for hours to make the bombs safe.
With the British bomb, you have a particularly difficult task on top of it all. Once the fuses have been removed, the detonators have to be pulled out. They are highly sensitive. The problem with it is that over time crystals could have formed, and they are highly explosive.
The bomb was found last week during construction work in the city's West End. It's an area home to Germany's central bank, where half of the country's gold reserves are stored.
Into the dusk and through the long, dark hours.
The HC-4000 bomb was dropped on Frankfurt by the Royal Air Force in 1944. There are thought to be hundreds of thousands of unexploded bombs across Germany. Legacies of the intense bombing campaigns against the Nazis. The scale of this evacuation was unlike any other. More than 60,000 people forced to leave. Elderly residents recalled wartime memories.
I was here in West End during the war. I heard the bombs falling when I was in the basement, and I helped to extinguish the fires.
Police officers carried out door-to-door checks before the bomb was successfully disarmed. But it will take decades to safely defuse the thousands of other bombs still buried beneath German towns and cities.
The BBC's Sarah Corker ending Checkpoint for tonight. Thank you so much for being with us. On behalf of our excellent team, have a fantastic evening. We'll be back tomorrow night at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. National says there's an $11 billion hole in Labour's alternative budget, but Labour says the claim is just a desperate attempt to mislead voters. The Greens say National's proposals to speed up house building will only benefit developers. A communication breakdown is being blamed for the unbearable suffering of a dying Nelson man, and the need for another medical school for rural GPs is under fire. Our next news and weather is at 7. But this is Trending Now, our feature highlighting the stories you've been sharing via digital and social media. Education consultant Bali Huck has written a book to help parents navigate the minefield that is the New Zealand secondary school system. He spoke to Catherine Ryan.
So I know that lots of parents really agonise about what school to send their children to, and it's obviously really, really important. It's a critical time and parents are concerned. So that business of that school choice is a biggie. And yet, I think the message that I have in the book is this, that we have a really good education system in New Zealand by most counts. And so, my advice would be send your child to your local school. Generally speaking, you'll find it's a good school. Having said that, we know that parents are going to be